Welcome. Today I wanted to talk about two hooks that are available in React called the useContext and useReducer. So let's get started. To demonstrate that, basically I have an example that I've used before for hooks and other things. But essentially what we want to use and demonstrate is that when we increment, we want the counter to increment and we want to be able to see it's incremented by whom or the name of the person. And essentially here I have a drop down. I can select who is going to change that, and so we want to demonstrate that as well. So if you look at the code itself, it should be pretty straightforward. And I want to explain to you where I want to make the changes. So basically in the app.js, we are displaying these two components, increment button and change user. And this is where we want to make the change. And we also want to make change in the app.js to use the context. So let's first do the context. So what I have done is we are going to get some my context from my file. So let me just show you what's in my context and how you create context. Go to definition, or maybe go this one. Let me see if I can find it here. Okay, it's here. All right, so we basically set my context is equal to react.create context, and we are going to specify some initial value for it. The username is just going to be say dummy, and we are going to provide a change username method or a function, and this is just a signature. It's not really used, but that gives us the shape of the context. We'll have username and change username in the context itself. So let's just use this context here somewhere. So we got the context. Uh, at the app level, we want to have a state variable that we use to maintain who is the user of this app. So let me just copy a little bit of code and I can basically provide that information. So we are going to set essentially the initial state here. And let's just see this. So the state is going to be an object where username is going to be dummy. And the way you change the username, some component that are downstream, then they can call this method change username. They'll provide a variable called name as to what the new name should be. And we are going to just set the state to be username equal to name. So username will be changed. So that's really what it is. So at the top level, we want to provide that state. So let me just add the provider for context, and the way to do that is just say my context. Here we get the my context, and you can just say provider, and that should basically provide a provider here. And we want to encapsulate everything under the provider. The only other missing thing is we want to provide an initial value to this. And the way to provide that is just provide a property called value. And the value we want to provide is just the state. So that should basically in our context provide the state here, and you get the state. So you see this is all in the app. So now we have two other methods where we want to be able to use this context, and I'm going to first show it in increment button as how we can use the context, but not really anything else. It's a counter by and need to fill this in by whom and all that. So let me just copy some code for the counter, and the counter we will use the context very simply by just saying use context is equal to. So the way to use the context is essentially this: context is equal to this and counter by, and here you can just access the context dot username, because that's what we provided in the context, and we have the context and we're going to use it. So that should be pretty straightforward. And let's see how our app behaves now. And so here you can see the name, which was the dummy, is now being accessible. So use the context is actually pretty straightforward here. We can just do this use context, and use context is available from React, and we give it the context we had, and we can just access the context here, context.username. So that's pretty easy actually to do the context here. Now the other problem we want to solve is how to change this context in some downstream uh, area where we are selecting the counter name and we changing this. So I have prepared some code for that, and let's just copy that code because it will be easier and I won't make any typing mistakes. It should be pretty straightforward. So I'm going to essentially replace this with this. And you will see that you should be able to change the name here, Yogesh. And let me explain to you what changes I made. Basically, I just added my context.consumer. We are going to consume this context. And the way to do is to encapsulate this into uh, essentially a curly brackets. And in the curly brackets, we will have an object which will have destructured values of username and change username. Remember, this was just the actual username, and this is just a method that is coming in from the context, because we get it because we did this my context.consumer. So we got those two things, and now we are basically providing a render method here essentially. So it says last incremented by username, whatever the username was, and on change we get an event which is essentially the value event.target.value, and we are going to call this method change username, which is at the top level the state, so it will change it. So you can actually easily demonstrate that it is changing the name here, and I can change it back to something else, and I had some breakpoint, so you can see it is coming in increment button as the context, and the context has a username changed, right? So let's just keep going, and then you can see this is working. So that's very nice how you can use the context and change it from a child consumer. And this has good applications and how you might use it in an actual app as well. The only other thing that's left to kind of demonstrate is how to do the use reducer, and that for that I'm going to copy some code as well, and let's see what this does, and I will explain it. So we are in the increment button. We already did the context stuff. We want to use something called a reducer. So we have a variable which will be using counter, and we want to even actually display it as value. So we will just display it like this, counter by who context that username. So we got a counter and we have a dispatch function, and we will use a reducer, and the reducer is going to use this method called reducer count, and we can go to that one, and you can see that's actually done in a way the normal. If you are familiar with Redux, you can see you will get some initial state and an action, and here we are seeing action type is add count. We will just take the current state and we will take the payload and add to that and return that as the new state. That's how the reducers usually work: current state and action, and you return a new state. So that's what this simple reducer is doing. So it's incrementing it. So only other thing that's left is we want to be able to call the dispatch function when we do a click. And that's also pretty straightforward. I don't know if I have some code here to copy it. Yes, I have a code I can copy to essentially do this. And I'm going to copy it where we used to have a null in here. And what this is doing is it is basically going to call the dispatch function. Type is add count, payload is 1, and it's basically going to change the new state. And that should work, and let's see if it is working. What is the problem here? It says context failed to compile, and if a context has already been declared. Oh, okay, context is equal to use context, and we have twice. Okay, so that's easy to fix. We can delete one of these. Let's see if it works. Yes, it is now there. Now we can see the names are still there. We can change the name. and we can skip this debug statement. So we got this, and let's see if the counter works. And we are coming in the increment button, the counter, and I had a breakpoint, so I can basically let it go. So here you can see the counter has become 1 again, and if you want to increment, you can see it increment again, and the counter is also then. So to recap, basically I've shown you how to use the useReducer and the context, and you can just access the context directly like username. In the change user, my context.consumer, you can get the constant, destructure the context like this and use it. And the app is where you provide the context provider and a value, and you can store the state at the top level. So this is a good example of how to be able to use. You may not want to use this if you're already using Redux, but you might encounter some code which is using use context, use reducer, and this will be hopefully of use to you in terms of how to do that. I will add this video under my website under React use reducer and use context in however minutes it took to create this video, and you have a great day.